Everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Women in Tech series, brought to you by the Hawaii Technology Development Corporation, HTDC, the Entrepreneurs Sandbox, and the True Initiative. My name is Sarah Nanbu, and I'm the General Manager at the Entrepreneurs Sandbox. Before we start, for those of you who are new to the series, I'd like to quickly introduce the organizations behind this effort. The Hawaii Technology Development Corporation, or HTDC, is a state agency attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism. HTDC's mandate is to grow the tech economy and workforce here in Hawaii. The Entrepreneur Sandbox is a co-working facility in Kaka'ako, owned by HTDC and managed by Box Jelly, a Hawaii-based co-working company. If you haven't visited the Sandbox, I encourage you to do so next Tuesday for Free Co-working Day, where you can experience what it's like to co-work from the Sandbox. Last but not least, the True Initiative. That's a joint effort among the private and public sectors, together with the state of Hawaii, to encourage knowledge sharing and adoption of technology and best practices to create a resilient and thriving Hawaii. The True Initiative is an extension of the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, and if you're interested in learning how you or your organization can be part of the True Initiative, please visit hec.org/true. And now a few housekeeping items before we dive into today's session. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be sent to all registrants. Please send in any questions through the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's webinar. At the end of today's session, we will share a link to a survey in the chat. The team behind the Women in Tech series reads each survey response, and we use your feedback to guide the development of the series. So if you could take a few minutes after today's session to complete the survey, we'd really appreciate it. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend, Simone Smith. Simone has spent the last year and a half working at Amazon Web Services, AWS, and was recently promoted to manage the digital and global activation teams at AWS. In her role, she manages 13 direct reports to adapt and execute AWS product and solution campaigns across the world. She has previous experience with marketing automation, digital marketing, and marketing strategy, and has worked at several early to late stage B2B technology startups in Portland, Oregon. She's a staunch advocate for diversity and inclusion workplace initiatives, and in her free time, enjoys hiking with her dog Lola. Thanks, Simone, for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah. So first, could you please share what it's like to work at AWS? I'm personally very curious to know what it's like to work for such a large tech company. And if you could share what your day-to-day looks like, and how it's evolved during the pandemic, that would be really awesome.
Yeah, so I really enjoy working at AWS. I like to kind of phrase it as it feels like you're working at a giant startup, in that there's just so many opportunities to be super agile and to create new processes, but at the same time, you have sort of the backing, stability, and resources of Amazon. And so for me, it's sort of the perfect combination where I had previously sort of started my career within startups and now have really the sort of bandwidth and opportunity to help scale. And so for me on a day-to-day basis, a lot of what I do involves working with global teams to execute their digital programs. And so meeting with stakeholders, meeting with the digital teams, and then having those regular communication cadences to talk through what our roadmap looks like, what the upcoming programs look like, and then how tactically we're going to go about doing everything to meet our deadlines.
And how has your role changed or evolved during the pandemic?
Yeah, so it's been very interesting. I feel like I've been pretty fortunate where when I started this role working with so many stakeholders across the world, so, you know, in LATAM and EMEA, in APAC time zones, a lot of the communication I was having was either via email or over video calls anyways. So for me, it's definitely been an adjustment. I feel pretty fortunate to have already had these established mechanisms in place. I think the biggest thing for me is I used to travel quite a bit to meet with some of these global stakeholders. And so that's, obviously on pause for the time being, but a lot of my sort of day-to-day has shifted to virtual calls.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that for a tech organization, the transition to working from home has been pretty seamless for a lot of folks. But yeah. Um, so since I've had the privilege of working with you, I know most of your career journey, but I'm hoping that you'll share the roles that you've had and what's led you to your current position at AWS.
Yeah, so I started my career working a series of sort of marketing internships. So I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be in marketing. I just love how it's a combination of being able to be very data driven and creative at the same time. And so interned for a number of companies, some startup organizations too, and then eventually started full-time working as sort of a digital marketing associate. So it was kind of a broad role where I was helping to write like press releases for new products and then helping out with ad hoc sort of tasks now and then. And then eventually kind of branched further into digital marketing where I was helping with things like search engine optimization, paid social advertising, social media marketing, managing websites, and then eventually got really interested into digital marketing and then marketing automation. So managing sort of the tech stack behind all of the different activities happening, whether it's our CRM or our marketing automation system. And so I think the combination of sort of marketing automation and digital marketing really helped me find a path in my career to where I am now, where I have both of those backgrounds to be able to assist in launching campaigns.
Yeah. And one thing that I know, you've survived an acquisition. That's something that, in the startup world gets talked about a lot. That's what happens to the companies. I remember when you were going through that, we chatted and you said something that has really stuck with me. You were like, well, I saw this acquisition coming. I knew that I needed to make my role critical to making this work. Could you share a little bit more about that story and just sort of your process in identifying needs and then how you went about filling them?
Yeah, so that was definitely an interesting experience. I feel pretty fortunate where I had some idea that it was going to happen ahead of time, especially since the organization I was at was pretty small. So it was pretty easy to determine that, something was going to happen. And so for me, that process was basically looking through what I was doing in my day-to-day and trying to figure out how it aligned to the greater organizational goals. And then thinking about, when we eventually merge with this other team and this other company, what types of things are going to be important and what am I doing now that is aligned to that or isn't aligned? And so for me, it was trying to figure out what types of gaps there were within my work, where I was pretty fortunate where I was overseeing and managing the entire sort of marketing database system. So I knew pretty early on that I would need to be involved with sort of the mapping over of these different systems. And then also just wanted to make sure I had extra visibility with my teammates and with my leadership. So they knew that I had that skill set to help fulfill those needs. And so I think that was one thing that was really important to me in being able to communicate how and why I'm indispensable to an organization, especially at a time when a lot of folks ended up not transitioning over to the new company.
Sure. And now merging two databases together, that sounds like a pretty technical task. And, like you shared, your background isn't a traditional tech background. You're not a developer. How did you learn how to do that? Like, how did you know how to merge two databases together?
Yeah, it was definitely challenging. And I think this is one thing that I really valued about working at startups, where oftentimes I would work within an organization and I would be the only person that would be managing this tool. So, I had to figure out how to do it. And so for me, one of the most helpful things is being able to leverage online resources. Oftentimes, if you're using a specific system or a tool, these companies will put out really great help documentation. And then I made sure to get really involved in different customer user groups. And then also, I'm a part of a number of different industry organizations within marketing to be able to leverage that network and say, hey, I know I'm not the only person that's been through an acquisition or that's had to merge databases. Like, someone has done this before me. And so where can I go to learn how that happened and what I need to do?
Yeah, that sounds like you've been forced to be pretty resourceful in figuring out how to solve the problems that you've been presented with.
Yeah, I find it super helpful to kind of approach things as, there's definitely some sort of model out there of how this can be done, even if, it's not a one-to-one sort of comparison. There's always some sort of related activity. And so for me, I really like to leverage researching what else is out there and what oftentimes free tools are available, and what types of guides can help me through that.
Yeah, and one thing I want to make note of, you mentioned free resources, and that's come up throughout this Women in Tech series. A few of our other speakers have mentioned, just knowing that there's so much information out there, and especially with the current state of the pandemic, so many events and conferences that normally have really expensive registration fees are going virtual. So a lot of their content's online for free or reduced costs. So just a few other people have mentioned the importance of taking advantage of what's available right now. And obviously, there are sites like YouTube and a lot of companies offer, like you mentioned, help docs that are really helpful to get people up to speed. Yeah. That sort of leads us into my next question. What advice would you have for other folks on our call or watching this webinar who want to have similar roles that you've held? Or if you could, maybe let's keep it pretty open-ended. What advice do you have for others interested in your career path?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I know has really helped me is being able to leverage any sort of existing free certification out there. And so one example for me was becoming certified in Google Analytics and then Google Ads. And they're really great sort of digital marketing free resources from these various companies online. And so that provided me with sort of the context into a different function I wasn't directly familiar with. And then also sort of like the virtual justification and proof that I have experience in a particular topic. And so those types of certifications have been super helpful. I know for me, when I ended up having to take over a Salesforce instance at a new organization, I became a pretty active member of the Salesforce Trailhead community, where it's kind of gamified and you have these different learning modules you can go through, and you can also get various certifications through there too. And so even things like LinkedIn Learning that was offered through a library series in the city I was living at the time. And so for me, anything that that is available, that is kind of learn at your own pace and that provides some sort of certification that's recognized within the industry would be my number one recommendation.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that you, in a previous conversation, we were talking about how the fact that you had the Google Analytics certification on your resume helped you stand out from other candidates, especially when you were really early in your career. And that ties into the fact, another part of our conversation where you mentioned that digital marketing these days is constantly evolving. Things that you need to be able to execute now didn't exist 2, 3, 5 years ago. So really the ability to demonstrate your willingness to learn new technologies in order to stay up to date and to stay relevant and meet market needs is really what's more important than the number of years you've existed in an industry.
Definitely. And I know one sort of way I try to keep up to date is by signing up for various industry newsletters just to see what's changing within these different tools and then within different organizations. And that's one of the things I really do love about working in the technology space is because everything is changing all the time, especially if you're looking to make a career change or you're, earlier on in your career, there's just so much opportunity because a lot is changing. A tool that I've been using is not the same as it was even, 6 months ago. And so I think being able to leverage all of the different content and training that's out there in a continuous way is what's really helped me too.
And now, keeping in that advice track, I know that you were recently promoted. Congratulations. And so you've made a transition from being an individual contributor to managing a team and having direct reports. Could you share more about what that's like and how you've been able to navigate that?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting transition, especially having worked in a number of teams that have been pretty under-resourced where I was very hands-on with a bunch of the different day-to-day tasks. I think the biggest thing for me kind of going into that is just being able to learn to delegate and lean on your team. And then to also sort of throughout that process, make sure that when you're interacting with your team and with your supervisor to always be surfacing accomplishments and the value of what you're able to contribute to the team and make sure that's visible in some sort of capacity. And so for me, that took the sort of the format of making sure everything I did was documented so it was referenceable and that it made an easy case for that type of promotion process. And then that's also sort of the same information I'm recommending to my team now too, just because I'm always looking to make sure folks within my organization are growing as well and have the same opportunities.
Yeah, and I think that as I mentioned in your bio, you're passionate about diversity and inclusion initiatives in the workplace. And I think one of the important conversations that happens when we talk about diversity and inclusion is the kinds of pathways for advancement for team members. And so it totally makes sense that because you're passionate about that as a manager now, you're making sure that there are those pathways for the people who report to you to rise up at AWS. Let's see. I have so many questions that I want to ask you, so I'm trying to figure out the right one. But maybe one. Let's take this segue. So, this is a Women in Tech series, and I've asked you a lot of questions about your career in tech. But let's take a step back and talk about the industry as a whole. You and I have had many conversations about navigating the industry as a woman, as a petite woman of color. Can you share your experience, just because it is a unique lens to look at the industry?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to be honest, it has not been easy. I've worked for organizations where, being a woman of color in tech has been more challenging than others. And I mean, I can think of so many different examples. I know one example was I worked for a company and we were redoing sort of the building and all of our leadership essentially was comprised of men. And so basically they wanted to create sort of the stairwell that had these massive sort of slits between them. So you could essentially see whoever was walking up the stairs. And then afterwards they wanted to put a lounge at the bottom of the stairs. And I remember thinking, wow, I really have to change the way that I dress to be able to go to work now because I can't wear a dress anymore or a skirt. And there are so many little things like that that are just reminders and sort of micro invalidations of, being a minority in a predominantly male space. Things like that are just very sort of easy to forget, but they send very small messages that make it a little bit more difficult. And even sort of at a macro level, being present in meetings and having to constantly repeat myself or talk over people because my ideas are being sort of repurposed and then recognized in other areas is definitely a challenge. And I know for me in my current role, it's definitely been interesting where, you know, especially because of the way I look, sometimes I'm perceived as being an intern, or I know at one organization, everyone kept thinking I was a secretary just because I sat sort of towards the leadership area, and they just assumed that I wasn't, you know, an actual member of the marketing team. And so I know this is just something that I've had to kind of grapple with and work through every day, especially within the tech space, where oftentimes I've worked on many teams where I've not seen anyone that has looked like myself. And I feel pretty fortunate now within this new role that I have that it's one of the most diverse teams I've ever been on. And I have a really great support system to sort of recognize these things.
Yeah, and it makes sense that if you're working on campaigns across the globe, that your team would need to be sensitive to um, having a diverse team to produce the best messaging and marketing.
Yeah, and that's also been another really sort of big initiative of mine, especially now as a hiring manager, to make sure that the team that is participating in some of these activities reflects the communities that we are marketing to. And I think that's been a really great sort of takeaway in this new role is being able to be sort of an advocate for that level of change in this type of capacity.
Yeah, that's great. Um, and sort of on that note, we've recognized that there are a lot of challenges with being a woman of color in tech. But where do you see hope and where do you see progress?
Yeah, I think that as more people come into these roles and as people are promoted through these roles, I think representation is extremely important, especially within leadership, because oftentimes that's where it's lacking. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And then many organizations have different employee resource groups where, you know, if you self-identify with a specific group, there's an affinity community that is available to you. And so I know having worked at startup organizations where that was not something I could participate in, being able to look in my broader community within my own city is just a really great sort of additional way to champion that change too.
And adding to that, one resource that we often hear in this series is the importance of mentors and mentorship. And I was wondering if you could add how what your experience with mentorship has been, um, and and how maybe you see that changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been challenging too. I know I worked in an organization where I was on a team with all white men, and then my company as a whole was not as diverse as it could have been. And so for me in that scenario, it was very difficult to find a mentor. So I leveraged sort of my women in tech community and sought out sort of relationships outside of my own company. And then now in a bigger organization, I'm fortunate enough to have sort of access to a giant community of mentors, of folks who are volunteering and eager to start mentoring other folks. And so I think that's one thing that's been very helpful is to be able to have that outside sort of impartial perspective to what you're experiencing, to be able to gain that sort of perspective.
That's great. I think, let's see. Um, okay, I do see a question coming in through the Q&A, so let's jump over to that really quickly. So what language or translation tools do you use when engaging AWS customers from other countries? So I guess the question is more, are you using translation services or do you have team members who have backgrounds in those languages?
Yeah, so when we work with a number of the global stakeholders, oftentimes we're corresponding in English. Otherwise, we have translation tools like AWS Translate, where we will usually have a lot of written correspondence. And so I'll leverage a tool like that to be able to understand the various languages that are coming in.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Um, yeah, let's see. Maybe um, sort of related to that, in learning new technologies. You know, one thing that you and I have talked about is just the importance of identifying needs either or skills gaps and then going out and filling those gaps. Could you walk us through your process? I think for you it probably makes a lot of sense because it's something that you do naturally, it comes naturally to you. But I think for a lot of people, especially if you're new in an organization, figuring out how you can really make yourself valuable is kind of tricky. So could you walk us through that process?
Yeah. One thing that I found is really helpful is staying pretty up to date with industry reports. So oftentimes there is an annual report related to whatever industry you're in, kind of talking about the state of how things are and what types of tools organizations are investing in, what types of skills are up and coming. And so another thing that I'll look at is sort of like the MarTech annual report to see what types of new tools are being added and to what level they're being leveraged within different organizations, sizes, industries, and so forth. And so I will oftentimes go through those reports, look at the tools, and then go to each of their websites and see what types of resources are available. Sometimes I know, especially when I was at an organization and was partially responsible for buying new technology tools, I would sign up for demos with all of these different companies just to see what's happening, how it's working, and then also kind of look around and see what types of user groups there are, and then leverage that sort of network to say, hey, you know, what types of things are you seeing for next year? What are you planning? What types of things are top of mind for you? And so I find that that tends to be really helpful in pointing a direction of sort of a short list of things that I know I want to look into, especially if it's giving specific names or specific organizations that you can look further into.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now, because I know you have experience working at startups, working in startups with limited resources, how would you, what advice would you have for somebody who doesn't have the ability to, go out and purchase the software or who has to make the business case for it? How have you made cases for getting the resources that you need?
Yeah, I think for me, I've definitely wanted to leverage whoever is sort of selling whatever tool I wanted to buy and make sure that they're partnering and sort of making that type of case. So oftentimes I would say, hey, you know, I'm in this type of industry. These are sort of my main business needs. Can you give me examples of other companies that have been in similar situations and how they've leveraged this type of technology and what sort of the return looked like for them and how long it took to realize that return so that then I can go sort of collate all of this information into why it's relevant to the organization I'm in.
Yeah, so it sounds like you take a really data-driven approach to be able to make the business case for your organization to adopt the technology that you want.
Yeah,
How
I
would you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, I'm a huge advocate of definitely leading with data, and especially it kind of relates back to our earlier conversation of being a woman in tech. Oftentimes it can be difficult to sort of relay messages. And so for me, one of the most powerful things is being able to leverage data, which can be impartial to help sort of articulate an argument. So that way, especially if it's documented, it's very clear what the ask is, and sort of any sort of gender bias can be removed.
Yeah, that's great. And I was going to say that, in your career, you've really been the person to have to document that. So what advice would you give for anyone else who, is going to take that approach and bring that to their manager? How do you, I guess maybe, what do you document? How do you document it? How frequently are you sharing this information with your managers?
Yeah, so if it's around career progression and just sort of what I've been doing, I make sure to communicate that on at least a monthly basis. I think that one thing that I've learned is being able to leverage one-on-one time that I have with my manager as an opportunity to surface what I am doing, and then also where I am blocked if something is sort of impeding my ability to get something done. And then being able to quantify that and say, hey, I'm being inundated with these high priority, low impact requests. If I need to prioritize this, it means that it's 40 hours of work. So I need to deprioritize 40 hours of other work. And so I think for me, being able to quantify anything and then regularly make sure that that is how I am communicating with broader folks on my team is super helpful. And then in terms of documenting, I leverage so many different templates that I research and just find throughout through my research online. And so even if it's something like a template for budget, oftentimes someone else has created something. I'll look within my own organization and see what types of resources are out there and leverage teammates to say, hey, have you done something like this? Can I model what I am trying to do off of what you've done?
Yeah, wow, that's great. That seems really awesome that you would leverage the resources that already exist. And that's great. Let's see, it looks like we have another question. Let me jump to the Q&A. So this is specific to, specific to women in marketing and technology. What are some of your favorite newsletters or forums? You and I have also talked about Slack channels and Slack workspaces. So maybe if you could share the specific resources that you turn to.
Yeah, so with the different Slack groups, and I know some of these might be very regionally specific, I was a pretty avid member of a group called Chick Tech, and then also just Portland Women in Tech marketing associations. I was an active member of the American Marketing Association, Search Engine Marketing PDX when I was living in Portland. And I'm also usually a pretty avid member of the different technology user groups. So was in sort of a Salesforce user group, Marketo user group. And then for newsletters, I like to subscribe to all sorts of different industry folks. And so I know I like to look at what my competitors are doing as well. And so I think with Google is one that I'll sign up for. Google Digital Garage Studio is one that I'll sign up for, in addition to a bunch of others.
Yeah, and it sounds like obviously you're in a digital space, you're in a tech field, you're leveraging a lot of digital resources, and that has come up in a few of our past sessions. Folks have shared the importance of networking, and their comment has always been, yeah, in-person industry networking is really important. Can't really do it right now, but given the state of everything, you're proving that networking is possible and that you can leverage the digital communities that exist for networking. Do you have any other tips for folks who are trying to network right now?
I was just going to say, I know one platform that's been really effective for me has been Slack. And I used to be sort of able to find these different communities through this tool called Meetup, where you can sort of identify what types of group meetings are happening that are related to your interests. And then for me, in sort of like the COVID era, Slack has been a really good channel to be able to communicate with these different folks within my industry to see, oh, you know, this person's interested in, you know, bot traffic within this website Slack channel. And that's something that I'm interested in too. And so I've been able to connect with people just by seeing what they're posting and to message them directly and say, hey, I'm, you know, really interested in this type of thing and would love to set up a virtual call to learn more, or we'll ask for resources and things like that.
That's great. Okay, so we have one other question that came in through the Q&A. For folks who would like to pivot or move into digital marketing, do you have advice for them? What are some strategies that they could undertake to make this move?
Yeah, so the big one I would sort of reiterate is any type of free certification that's available, make sure to take advantage of. I know, especially if you're on the job hunt, this is something that can sort of make you stand out. The other thing that I would say, especially within digital marketing, is if there's any sort of nonprofit opportunity where you can contribute in a digital marketing space, that's another way to sort of gain experience. I know within the American Marketing Association, as an example, I was sort of doing volunteer work, offering pro bono digital marketing services, and then could then add that to my portfolio to say, hey, you know, I ran paid search for this nonprofit, and this is sort of the result that I was able to deliver as being a part of that. And it also provides a really great opportunity to connect with other folks and build a network there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I bet you know, the being able to show the results of what you were able to do is really important in showing that you know the skills that you're presenting on your resume.
Yeah, being able to sort of articulate what was the impact on top of what you did.
Are there specific emerging roles or opportunities that you think would make the transition easier? So again, people who are pivoting into digital marketing, are there specific roles or certifications um, or or opportunities or technologies that people should really be familiar with?
Yeah, so for digital marketing, I would say search engine optimization is definitely sort of one of the core pillars. And there's so many great resources from like Moz and Ahrefs and so forth out there. I know when I was first learning SEO, followed this series of videos called Whiteboard Friday, where basically you learn sort of a new aspect of search engine optimization on Fridays. And so that was a really great resource. Another thing is search engine marketing, and then social media marketing. And so many of these tools we use every day, whether it's, you know, LinkedIn or Twitter, if you're on Facebook or Instagram. And then they have these different paid platforms that you can learn more about and just sort of see how you use it. All this information is generally available on these company websites. And so especially within digital marketing, having sort of a solid understanding of SEO, SEM, paid social, and then basic website analytics. Adobe provides really great resources, and then obviously Google does as well.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned search engine optimization. That's something that's constantly evolving, right? We're constantly hearing how Google's updating their algorithm. How do you stay up to date on current technologies? I know you've mentioned reading state of the industry reports, but are you still watching those Friday videos? Like what are daily or weekly, like low level ways that you're staying up to date on what's happening in the industry?
Yeah, I'm a member of a number of sort of LinkedIn groups and then a number of newsletters. So I will actively try to block out time once a week. For me, it tends to be on Fridays, where I can kind of look through all this information and stay up to date. Also for things that have like a blog, you can connect like an RSS feed to your personal Slack to be able to get that automatically to see sort of a feed of information. And so for me, that's kind of one way that I stay up to date. And then anyone that I follow on my different sort of social media channels, I'll make sure to see if there's an update in like a user community to see what everyone's talking about.
I love that you block time on your calendar, because I can see that if we don't make time for things like that, it's so easy to, just to get, off our to-do list or move to next week, and then we never make time for it. So I love that tip.
And
Um,
platforms so frequently that it really is important, at least for me in digital marketing, to pay attention to that, just because oftentimes something that I'm working through that is challenging becomes a new feature update that I didn't know about. And so I do try to make time to look into those.
that's great. Okay, one other question that we have. What are some digital trends that you're most excited about?
Oh. One of the digital trends that I'm very excited about is actually around data privacy. I know working in a previous organization that was focused on cybersecurity and identity and access management, sort of the European Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, was very sort of, it was a huge project. And so one sort of trend I'm excited to see is sort of more governance within digital marketing, which I know sounds very contrary to what I'm doing, especially with states like California leading that type of initiative, and then understanding how all of these different tools and companies will adapt to that, just because of sort of this changing climate of privacy.
Yeah, I guess, where should people turn to if they're interested in learning more about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because as a user of some of these tools, oftentimes I will get notifications, and I'm sure as a user of any product out there, you'll get notifications of privacy updates or changes to the terms of service. And when I was having to send out those notifications myself, I found myself reading all of them from all these other companies. And so that's one thing that I'll do is to just see there are also sometimes just governing organizations where you can look to as well. And so, yeah, that's one thing that I do. I always like to look and see what other companies are doing too.
That's great. So another question for you: as you transition into a management, or as you've transitioned to a management and leadership role, what are some of the skills that you had to work on?
Um, I would definitely say delegation is probably the biggest one for me. Just being able to make sure that I'm guarding my time, I'm making sure my teammates and my directs are guarding their time too. Just because oftentimes I'll be the one helping out with any type of escalation, and then being able to help reprioritize. And so that's been sort of the biggest thing where you have to come to accept you will have an unlimited amount of work at the end of the day, and that's okay. And it's really about how you're prioritizing and how you're communicating that the changes of the prioritization to others. And then also being able to learn more about how I can be more effective in building my own team and making sure everyone has the resources and the skills that they're wanting to gain for their given career path.
That's that's great. Yeah, I think I'm sure everyone who's had a manager who has struggled with that really appreciates that that's something that you recognize as a manager and really conscientious about when leading your team. Um, so another question for you. Is there someone in the field of digital marketing who you look up to? I think I'd expand that to, are there organizations with digital marketing that you really admire or are sure to follow?
Yes, I know within my own organization, I really look up to the VP of marketing within AWS, who is also a woman in tech. And then also just broadly within the sort of marketing space, the former VP of Marketo, which is now Adobe, who just transferred over to another organization, is someone that I follow. Oftentimes these tools that I'm a heavy user of, I'll make sure to see what these folks are doing either on LinkedIn or on Twitter is another way that I'll follow them.
Okay, so this question is more about your career path. Have you planned your career development? What are some ways you go about it? Do you do goal setting? Or do you have a 3, 5 year plan?
Yeah, so one thing that's been really helpful for me is being able to look at sort of a career leveling guide, a rubric where you can see, I'm at this level. If I want to get to this, next position, what are some of the attributes that my leadership is looking for? And then how long will it take for me to meet certain milestones? And I know that was one thing that I had to do in my new organization, where I knew I wanted to move up a level, and that in order to get to that point, I needed to fulfill a series of requirements. And so I would look at every type of request that I was getting within my own role, and then also see where there were opportunities outside of my day-to-day scope to grow, and then would make sure that I would focus on sort of those more strategic projects that aligned with where I wanted to be in the future. Many times organizations will provide this within their own companies, sort of a guide of or a matrix of these different roles. Other times I'll look sort of for online resources to see, what are sort of the different titles and how they progress throughout a given function. And then I'll look up job descriptions of these roles too to see, if I want to be a senior marketing automation manager, I'll look for that role on LinkedIn and then look up the job descriptions and see, lots of people are asking for this type of experience. It looks like I need to know more about, this specific tool. So I'll need to look into that and make sure to build that in. And so that's sort of how I've taken that approach.
That's really helpful and really insightful. I think that it's great for both people who are in organizations who have those resources, with career development plans, but also if you're at an organization that's probably smaller or maybe doesn't have that built out yet, there are other ways that you as an individual can take charge of that and build out that plan for yourself. It's great. Okay, so I think I have one more question for you. For those of you on the call who are familiar with our series, you know that we wrap up our every interview with the same question, and that's, what's the one word that you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I would probably say the one word I would leave would be grit. And I would say that just because, especially since this is a Women in Tech series, and then also being a woman of color, being able to be resilient, to be able to really believe in yourself and then have that confidence that you can progress throughout your career. I would say grit really sort of encompasses all of that, and then my startup experience and being really resourceful.
Yeah, since we spoke earlier, I knew that your word was going to be grit, and so I, looked it up, and I know that there are lots of characteristics for people who have grit. One of them is passion, and you obviously have that for your career. It's people who are purposeful and who are very conscientious, and from everything you've shared, you're very you are conscientious. You have that plan laid out. But I think we might both be able to agree that holding on to that grit sometimes can be kind of challenging, especially when faced with lots of obstacles, things like systemic challenges. How do you hold on to that, and how do you stay motivated?
For me, it's really been able to look to other folks who are in similar situations as myself, and then being able to leverage them as either a support network or a professional community, and as a resource to know there are so many different teams and groups that I can model my own experiences after. So even though, me in a role, especially as a woman in a role where sometimes I'm in rooms with just only men, or I'm the only person of color, it's a good sort of reminder to know that there's a network out there. You are not alone, even though sometimes it feels like it, and that so many other people are have either been through similar experiences or going through similar experiences, and you have a network that you can go to.
That's great. And I love that idea of grit. When I think of you, I definitely think of somebody who has the grit to succeed. So thank you so much, Simone, for joining us today and sharing all of great advice and insights into the tech industry. To all the